Good afternoon, folks. Dan Kirshner here, Executive Director of the Northwest Gas Association. Welcome to the August edition of the Northwest Gas Association's monthly webinar series. This month, we're featuring Jim Kibler, who's the Executive Director of One Future. I've known Jim for quite a while. We won't say how many years. In his previous life, Jim was Senior VP of External Affairs for AGL, Atlanta Gas and Light, prior to its purchase by Southern Company. I think, Jim, you completed your time with you in the utility world as president of Virginia Gas. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. And when Jim was doing the work for AGL, he really helped found One Future. And now in his retirement, he's serving as its executive director. A great leader for this effort and a great leader in general. So Jim, we're really grateful to have you join us. I just want to go over really quickly the rules of engagement for our webinar. So our folks that are regular on the webinar will know that we ask you to keep your microphones muted to minimize background. Enter any questions you have in the chat, and I will as I see questions come up in the chat, I'll interrupt Jim and ask your question on your behalf. And so, Jim, be prepared that when you take a breath, I may interrupt to ask a question that's been submitted in the chat. We are recording this webinar, and you'll be able to see that on our YouTube channel, or if some of your colleagues would be interested, you can refer them to this recording on our YouTube channel. Probably be up later today. Maybe tomorrow. We also, Jim, I think you're willing to make your slides available if folks ask for them, and so you'll see a link to that as well. Just one last note: our next webinar is Ralph Epling, who's a local RNG broker, developer, marketer. Many of you know Ralph from his days at BP IGI, Intermountain Gas Industries. Trading company. So we're looking forward to having him come and talk to us about what's it actually take to develop an RNG project, anaerobic digesters and the like in dairies, because that's what he's doing in his retirement. So looking forward to that. With that, Jim, I'm going to stop sharing and then stop talking, and we'll let you take it from here.
That sounds good. Can you guys see my screen?
We sure can.
Perfect. Well, listen, I really appreciate the invitation. Back in the day when I was a practicing lawyer, one of my clients was the Virginia Oil and Gas Association. So I have a deep appreciation for the work that regional gas associations do. And I was happy to be able to find a date to meet with you guys. So I know some of you have heard about One Future before, but I want to walk you through our history. We go back to 2014, and 7 companies formed One Future in response to the methane challenge that President Obama launched. We did so with one goal in mind, which was to ensure the future viability of natural gas. We've grown to more than 50 members. We have about 40% of the U.S. value chain. Our 2016 target, by the time we got up and running under an MOU with EPA, we set a target for 2025 to have a 1% leak loss rate across the value chain by that date. What's that mean? Well, it means taking the emissions intensity of our 5 segments, determining a way to aggregate those and report up a value chain emissions intensity that would be representative of the entire value chain if there were near universal adoption of our methods. We're a voluntary science-based coalition. We report our methane intensity annually by sector. We and as a roll up, we also provide a report to EPA annually that discusses our progress year over year and talks about our upcoming initiatives. We are a 501c6 trade organization. We don't have a PAC. We do not lobby. We are 100% focused on working collaboratively to reduce emissions. And our single criterion for membership, actually two of them. One is you have to be an operator that reports under Subpart W. But secondly, you got to agree that you'll work with us and collectively to reduce methane emissions across the value chain. All right. At the moment, we have 5 segments: production, processing, gathering, boosting, transmission, and distribution. And we have shown that our system will achieve emissions of less than 1% repeatedly over the last 5 years. And that's the point at which we often get questions, why did you choose 1%? There was a 2014 paper that asserted that if natural gas had a value chain emissions intensity of 1% or less, it would be superior to any other fossil fuel in any application and would be part of the climate solution. So we adopted that as our target for 2025. And by the way, this is pre 1.5C or any of the other targets that are out there. This is clearly just a response to a widely reported paper that asserted that the emissions intensity was probably something like 1.7, and we had a lot of work ahead of us. We worked with EPA to develop a protocol. We have since worked with NGSI to develop a methane intensity standard that its participants use for ESG purposes. And that updated or replaced our initial protocol. Participants in NGSI were interested in a few more sources than we had, but in both cases, our protocols go beyond EPA requirements under Subpart W because we have more sources and we use, in some cases, more stringent emission factors than required under Subpart W. We're seen widely as the standard for reporting methane emissions because we have a platform that assigns a methane burden, an emissions burden, a target to each segment. We built that around some 2016 data that indicated the relative marginal abatement cost of emissions reductions within each segment. And we assigned targets based upon that affordability or the cost effectiveness at each point in the value chain.
Hey, Jim, I have a
Go ahead.
question. Actually, this is a question from me. And that is, you've mentioned Subpart W a couple of times. I know that's the reporting mechanism. Can you tell me how Subpart W reporting equates or relates to EPA's GHG inventory of GHG sinks and its inventory?
Well, Subpart W incorporates GHGRP and GHGI. There are many companies that report under GHGRP. We are GHGRP plus GHGI, greenhouse gas initiative, I think it is, and One Future. So we have 3 sets of sources that are incorporated into our protocol.
Thank you.
You got it. Beginning in, like 2020, we started an internal discussion because we had done about as much as we can do with the emission factor plus based reporting. And we all know that many of the emissions factors are outdated. Some overestimate emissions, some underestimate emissions. And so we were working together as a group of companies to create a method to validate methane intensity on an individual company basis. And we initially started working with GTI Energy now, as they were standing up Project Veritas. I'll talk more about Veritas in just a moment. But our initial purpose was to help our members, to facilitate a way for our members who wanted to report a validated, third-party validated methane intensity. How can we incorporate enhanced measurement? What would that look like? How would you reconcile that against your bottom-up inventory of emission factors? Is there a way to incorporate top-down measurements and reconcile those to get to what stakeholders might view as a more representative or accurate emissions intensity? As Veritas rolled out, though, it became clear that it offered far more than that. And our discussion has now shifted to working to incorporate a monitoring, measurement, reconciliation, and verification platform into our existing protocol. Now, what does that mean? I'll talk more about that in a second, but how do we bolt on additional measurements and reconcile those to come up with a more representative emissions intensity? That's the challenge, I think, of our day and our time. And clearly, it's a hot topic internationally as we look at LNG cargoes, but domestically, DOE is working on the same thing. A little bit about Project Veritas. Again, we've invested as an association plus our members over $1 million with GTI to help launch this differentiated gas measurement and verification initiative. I'm going to claim a little bit of credit for this because when I was at Virginia Natural Gas and Southern Company Gas, we began an effort to dig into differentiated gas, certified gas, whatever you want to call it, for our own purposes. And we employed a consultant to help us, walk through that process and identify what it would take to bring more credibility and stakeholder acceptance to differentiated gas as a thing that had value in the energy transition. What we concluded was it's not a one company effort, and it's probably not a 5 or 6 company effort. It really needs to be across the value chain. It needs to have a lot of support from academics and scientists, from NGOs, certification organizations, public utility commissioners, other regulators. And you'll see in there on the fourth line, consistency, credibility, and transparency needed to be sort of the touchstones, the hallmarks of what we believe a proper differentiated gas platform would look like. And so Veritas launched with several protocols, which are summarized here, but there's an intensity protocol similar to ours that defines methane intensities for each segment of the natural gas supply chain. So check the box on that. There's a measurement protocol describing how to take the measurements to inform emission inventories by segment. And measurement can mean not only actual measurement, but it can also mean engineering calculations. But for example, it's nearly impossible to measure the gas lost in a blowdown, but you can certainly get a pretty accurate number using an engineering calculation. Some things are better measured, some things are better estimated. Then there's a reconciliation protocol, and this is how you go segment by segment with top-down, bottom-up reconciliation. A summation protocol, again, nearly identical to ONE Futures for how you add up those segments to attain a supply chain methane emissions intensity. And then importantly, an audit and assurance protocol so that stakeholders, including customers, can have confidence that what's being certified is accurate. And there's transparency into how that calculation was performed. There's an audit trail, and consistent application by third-party auditors to a single standard. I liken this to the laws on the trading of public securities, publicly traded securities, the Exchange Act, various financial regulations set up a requirement that a publicly traded company has to issue an annual report, and there has to be an auditor's opinion whether there are any material misstatements of the company's economic position. And not only is there that substantive standard, but then there's a procedural standard for how the auditor performs and renders an opinion. So it doesn't matter if you're comparing one security to another. It doesn't matter if Arthur Andersen or Ernst & Young did the auditing. They both follow the same general process. That's what this audit and assurance protocol does. It gives confidence that there's a standard way for the validation to occur. Let's shift a minute back to our reporting results. So reporting in 2018, based on results year 2017, and beginning in that year and for each of the 4 years subsequent, we have beaten that 1% target. Last year by 54%. What that means is, as you aggregate, summarize the emissions intensity of all of our members, we are 99.4% efficient delivering a molecule of gas from the rig to the burner tip. Probably more accurately, from the rig to the customer meter. And that, in our view, reinforces the value of sector or segment specific reductions versus what we've seen out there, some one size fits all approaches where an operator will simply adopt best management practices. We know in many cases that the equipment on a given asset differs from operator to operator. We know for sure that the emissions intensity of production varies greatly by basin. The average U.S. average emissions intensity for production is 0.47%. There are basins that are well above that average, some cases 10 to 12 times. There are some that are a fraction, in one case, perhaps a tenth of that. And even within basins, we'll see emissions intensity vary by operator, and even by operator, vary by asset within basins. And it's in part because of the age of the asset. It's in part because of the constituents of the formation from which the gas is being produced. Is it wet or dry? Is it associated? Is it a pure play natural gas? All of those things, including a variation of equipment and methodologies, really argues against a one-size-fits-all approach. Our approach is, we're going to set a target based on science. Give us, it doesn't matter if it's 1%, doesn't matter if it's 0.6, whatever the target is, we're then going to evaluate those cost-effective ways to reduce emissions at each point in the value chain, and we're going to go attack it holistically, because if we have the flexibility to identify asset by asset where the emissions are coming from various sources, that gives us the roadmap, so to speak, on how to generate the greatest emissions reductions in the most cost-effective way. By the way, almost uniformly, the CFOs of our member companies love us, because what our members are able to do is, one, benchmark themselves against others in the segment to show their progress or the challenge, and two, the roadmap. This is where I need to go to spend money this year to reduce our emissions the most cost-effective way. So we believe we've demonstrated that through our approach, we can minimize methane emissions and increase production and throughput, solving for both the climate and energy security challenges.
So Jim, I have a couple questions again coming from me, and this is just a reminder to our listeners here that if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Jim's more than happy to answer your questions. So mine are a little edgy, I think, but I know, Jim, you're accustomed to that. So so what you've laid out here for us is really a rigorous process. And I think you stated at the beginning that the overarching objective is to demonstrate that natural gas and its delivery system can and maybe ought to remain a part of our clean energy future at the end of the day, right? So that's kind of the overarching objective, my way of characterizing it. But you also then suggested that one of the things that you're working hard to do is to be credible with stakeholders. And you've laid out, as I said, a very rigorous process. So question one is your information received credibly by stakeholders? Because where I live, it feels a lot of times like certain stakeholders don't care about the data or the science. And I'm not trying to make a editorial comment, but we bring lots of science and data to them and just get kind of bulldozed. So is what One Future is doing in coordination with other entities that you've listed, is it being received credibly by, in particular, environmental NGOs and activists that are working hard on these issues?
Well, I think it depends on the organization.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
There's an organization that occupies a lot of space around it, methane emissions, and in private they'll say, "Yeah, you guys are great. You're doing an awesome job," but in public they won't say that.
Okay.
Right. They have donors to cultivate.
Okay.
There are organizations with whom we have worked repeatedly, and on this slide you'll see one, and another is the Clean Air Task Force, which is now working on Veritas. And we also work very well together with MIQ, which is sort of a joint venture between RMI and Systemic, to bring certified gas to market. What we've found in discussions, including the stakeholder meetings around Veritas, is that for the large part of the discussions, the environmental organizations see our platform as having made a really valuable contribution. But it's right. So some people say they move the goalposts. I tend to analogize it to the continuous improvement that all of us have taken on as a safety challenge, workplace safety challenge, right? Pipeline safety, workplace safety. You always want to be better tomorrow than you are today, right? So that's that continuous improvement is ingrained in our organizational DNA, and that helps greatly with our credibility for some NGOs.
Okay. Great. Okay, thank you. Second question on this slide, actually, a couple different places. You've been reporting for 5 years in a row. You've beat your 1% goal. Do you have enough data to show a trend line among the members that have been there for 5 years, as well as maybe generally speaking?
I have it, but the way we operate, all of that data is the members' data.
Yeah.
Right. And so in the aggregate, we report our organizational trend. And we've actually had a couple of really robust discussions around this because our membership is not static.
Yeah.
We've grown tremendously, including a huge tranche of members in 2019. You'll see in our segment targets year over year, there is movement within them. In some cases, because the newer members are not as far along the journey as some established members. And so, it might bump up in 1 year for that segment. The other factor is we include throughput in our protocol. So if you have demand destruction first year of COVID, you'll see lower throughput, but the emissions will be pretty static. So we had a higher emissions intensity that year.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really haven't agreed internally on the right way to represent a couple of different things. And one is, how do you show a trend line year over year? And two, how do you calculate the amount of gas that we've actually kept from entering the atmosphere?
Right.
So we're working through those things.
Yeah, that's exactly. I appreciate how complex the issue is, and that's why I asked the question. Because oftentimes we like to simplify, and so that's really what I was alluding to. Is in my question is really the complexity of doing what you're doing. So I think it's terrific. You're doing great work. Thank you.
Yeah, and often you'll see on both sides of the debate, some people attribute more accuracy than technology presently allows, and you'll see bold statements like, "Well, it's 7 or 8 times higher than what EPA is measuring." I'm not sure that's the case, because some of those measurements are taken with satellites that don't have the appropriate detection level to make that kind of calculation. So all we can do is get better every day. And I've got to update these numbers. We are in the process of updating these numbers based on membership growth. We're, I think, now in 18 of 38 production basins, and we've got distribution in 36 out of the 50 states. I'll show you a slide here in a moment that talks about our growth a little bit. We do fundamentally believe that the more, the merrier. The more folks who are at the table doing this work alongside us, the greater the possibility of ensuring the longevity of the industry and a healthy, robust environment. As you can see, we've doubled our membership since 2019. Large number of smaller operators have joined us recently. I have a story to share about an operator. It was family owned, formed in the 70s, a producer, and they were in a world of hurt. There were a bunch of notices of violation and some show cause orders, state and federal. They were about to be shut down. They were acquired by private equity. One of the first hires was an EHS person who had worked with one of our board members at a prior company. The second day on the job, he learned that they hadn't had a safety meeting since 1972. So his board directed him to find a platform. They chose One Future. In the first year, he was able to catalog all of his sources. And in year 2, he's now deploying. He's got a staff of 26 now. He's deploying satellites, flyovers, drones, and handhelds to get a better handle on his emissions. And he started to show reduction in emissions intensity. And he just called out of the blue to say, "I want to tell you, this wasn't off the shelf, but it was the closest thing I could find to a life preserver. And now we've turned the corner and our investors are extremely happy. And we hear that with a lot of our smaller operators who maybe haven't had the resources to build out a comprehensive EHS team, and they're finding us as a viable option to help them scale up quickly. Over this period of time, you can see our membership growth, 2018 to 2022. Last year, there was a 29% increase in natural gas production under our platform year over year. And deliveries were up 15% year over year because of new membership. And for the fifth consecutive year, we beat our methane intensity target. And Dan, it's in part because some of the stalwarts that were there early have now reached this sort of point of diminishing return until we can implement some enhanced measurement. But we continue to see growth and opportunity across all of our segments. Here are sector scorecards. Across the top, it will tell you how much the value chain we represent for each of these segments. As you can see, we represent the lion's share of transmission and storage, a big chunk of LDCs, and about 25% of US production. The challenge for us, then you'll see below that, you'll see our targets, our goals, and our actual performance. And our challenge has really been in gathering and boosting because of the compressor engines and methane slip. We adopted last year AP42 as an emissions factor for reciprocating engines. EPA has subsequently updated Subpart W to adopt it as well, but that's a much more stringent emission factor. We do have 10 of our gathering and boosting and other midstream companies this year who have done stack testing. So we'll have actual measurements on a lot of these reciprocating engines, and we've amended our protocols to allow them to report the actual stack test data as opposed to an emission factor. You'll see us share that data a little more widely as EPA further develops Subpart W. The Inflation Reduction Act requires EPA to update Subpart W with extrinsic data. And so we hope to be part of that process. This year, we have had four major things on our agenda. As I mentioned, when we started in the mid-2010s, we had an inventory of methane detection, abatement, and prevention technologies and practices. There were around, I think it's 11 or 12 total across all 5 segments. We've updated that this year, and we've got a little more scrubbing to do, but there are at least 20 such activities or technologies now deployed in each of our segments. So from, if you want to double count, which I think is okay in this perspective, we've gone from 12 to 100 or more just in the last 7 years. The technology is improving on a hockey stick curve, and our members are utilizing a lot of that technology, kicking the tires on it, using it in the Veritas demos, other opportunities to showcase technology either through OGMP 2.0 or as part of certifying methane intensity for MIQ. What we're finding is, as you might suspect in any case, some of the technologies deliver what they promise and some are helpful but maybe don't deliver what they promise. But at least we're helping to advance R&D and demonstrate the value of technology. One of our members was actually able to use satellites to conduct a leak survey in a central business district of a large American city. And for those of you who are familiar with leak surveys required by PHMSA, you have some cases you have to survey the sources annually, in some cases 3 years, some cases 5 years. And that's typically been a fairly labor intensive practice where you actually have to have boots on the ground, walking or driving from point to point and using measurement devices to detect leaks on customer meters, for example. In this case, they were able to get an 85% correlation on leaks on meters in a heavily developed central business district with very tall buildings in one day, as opposed to an annual survey. Now there's some limits on, you don't walk 365 days. You can't do it when it's raining. You've got a limited number of days. You don't want to do it when it's really windy. You have to have the right sort of ambient air conditions to perform a leak survey. So I don't want to say they replaced 365 days of labor, but they essentially replaced an entire year cycle of labor, which greatly sped up the find and fix cycle. Because when they went back out to validate the satellite data, they were able to fix the leaks as they were validating. We've also developed an LNG export-import protocol. That's the only part of the lower 48 onshore value chain that we do not have. We've developed it. We will be bringing that into our platform as a sixth segment next year or the following. We've been supporting MMRV development. Our members last year expressed a desire to see third-party validation that would be would have greater confidence by stakeholders. And so we've put a significant amount of money this year into the Veritas demos, and we have advocated with both GTI Energy and UNEP that there needs to be convergence or equivalence of Veritas and OGMP 2.0. You will see an announcement shortly from the United Nations that they will accept Veritas as equivalent to OGMP 2.0. We've also been engaging with EPA, Department of Energy, and the State Department on the need for convergence on certified gas platforms, whether for domestic purposes or for LNG export-import. There is just a ton of alphabet soup out there. And operators, right now you can't do everything, so you have to pick this platform or that platform because they are not sufficiently standardized in their work stream to accommodate the work streams of each other. And so operators are doing a cost benefit analysis on, is it OGMP 2.0? Is it Veritas? Is it MIQ? Equitable origin? There's really needs to be some commonality out there so that stakeholders will have more confidence in certified gas. Our work plan for next year, 2025 and likely 2026, is to take that inventory to update our 2016 marginal abatement cost study. And we'll adjust the cost effectiveness assessment of methods by segment. So we'll have an updated sort of method or technology by method or technology. If it costs $1, how much does it return within each segment? And then we are evaluating the results of the Veritas demos. There are 20 demos underway this summer. 9 of our members are participating. There are 11 other companies in the value chain that are participating. We'll assess an updated Veritas protocol to be released 2.0 will be released in December of this year. There will be a subsequent release of Veritas 2.1 probably in February that will allow the alignment with OGEMP 2.0, and will determine, our intention is to bolt on some MMRV platform to OneFuture at a future date, but we're going to take our time to make sure that what we are adopting is the most practical and most valuable. We're also, alongside that, like everyone else, we're assessing what does a supplemental rule do, what's happening with Subpart W, how does that affect GHGRP and our platform, how does this methane fee affect where we ought to be with our targets. That the Inflation Reduction Act, in imposing the methane fee, requires it to be based on Subpart W, which has to be updated to use extrinsic data. And then they've already put into law an emissions intensity for 3 or 4 segments. I believe we ought to align ultimately to ensure that our targets are at least as good as, if not more stringent than, what's set out in the methane fee. And then we also have to evaluate all the proposals that PHMSA has ongoing. And wouldn't you know it, as PHMSA tries to implement new rules around finding and fixing leaks, they're using different criteria than EPA is using, a different yardstick than EPA is using. So we're asking the agencies, you're in the same administration, can you please use the same standard? Based upon all of that work, at some point, we will develop a post-2025 value chain and segment target reflecting all the above. Is that going to be 0.5? Is it going to be 0.6? Is it going to be 0.8? I don't know what that is. We do have work that DOE's National Energy Technologies Lab did for us in 2016 and 2018, that using their life cycle analysis tool, they assessed our protocol and suggested 0.6 was where we would land. I think the noise in the emissions factors is why we're probably lower than 0.6. So we want to take our time and get it right. But at the same point, we want to show continuous improvement. And that's my my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. Do we have any in the chat?
None in the chat, but I have another one, Jim. So, gosh, I feel like I'm monopolizing your time. If any of you have questions, please enter them into the chat. Jim will be happy to answer. Here, my question is, you're doing sector-specific work and actually operator-specific work, I think. So, how would you talk to an entity in any one of the sectors, from, let's call it a LDC to a producer, who may be a little smaller than the others and may not have a lot of resources, but may feel like they've got to somehow or other, how do you talk to them about the value of OneFuture in the context of maybe this isn't something they even have tracked before? How would you talk to a smaller entity in any of the sectors about that?
Well, in fact, right before this call, I had a discussion with a small midstream operator from Appalachia, and I used this presentation. And it's, we've also had the discussion with EPA's voluntary programs team. They've got $1.5 billion to assist operators in reducing their emissions. They've encouraged us to apply for a grant that would allow us to onboard smaller operators, allow them to use our protocol, participate as a full member in OneFuture. Our due structure is really cheap. If you have revenues of less than 175 million a year, our dues are $9,000 a year. Above that, 17.5. That's, our initial dues were, the first 7 companies paid $50,000 a piece. So we get it. We don't have any full-time employees. I'm a part-time guy. We have technical consultants that, part-time. We have communications vendor, part-time. I wouldn't say we run this out of a shoebox, but it's the digital equivalence of a shoebox. We believe, and I haven't seen this countered anywhere. We believe that we are the only platform in the world that has developed a way to assess, to plug in an individual operator into a segment, to combine the segments, and to report out a value chain wide emissions intensity. It's not quite life cycle analysis because it doesn't include combustion emissions, but for the value chain, it is. We are also the only platform that can quickly include MMRV as part of what we're doing. And quick is probably a 2 or 3 year process. And I'll be clear, there are some of our members who are not ready for MMRV. There are some that are chomping at the bit. But I believe in the old African proverb that if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And so we're taking our time and ensuring that we're providing value for all our members.
Okay. Other questions? Any other questions? I think we're good. Jim, you have one more slide with your contact info on it, maybe?
I do somewhere.
I think it's the very next slide, maybe, is what I've got in the deck you sent me yesterday.
Yep.
There it is. So I'd encourage our listeners to take this information down and be in contact with Jim if you have other questions about ONE Future, if you have an interest in finding out how they can support you in continuous improvement on methane emissions reduction, give Jim a call. I know he'd be happy to talk to you. So Jim, I'm grateful that you were able to join us today. Thank you very much for your time and providing us with this good information. For the group on the call, just a reminder that our next webinar will be September 21st from noon to 1 again, and we'll be hearing from Ralph Epling about the nuts and bolts of what it takes really to put together an RNG renewable natural gas digester project. So should be really interesting stuff. So with that, I will say thank you very much one more time, Jim. You're getting lots of thank yous in the chat there. Folks, I'll wish you a great day and a good rest of your summer, and we look forward to seeing you in September. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Dan. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good seeing you.